before we get started, I do want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that the SFU Burnaby campus is located on the ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Kiki, and Coquitlam First Nations. Just take a moment to acknowledge the privilege, the immense privilege that we have to be able to live and play and work on these lands. And for those of you who might be joining us from other locations, take a moment just to reflect on whose spaces you might be occupying. So we are really thrilled today to hear from Dr. Kris Marsh, who is our final speaker for the semester in the social area, Brown Bag series. Dr. Marsh is an associate professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Sociology. She has a PhD from the University of Southern California, and she has dedicated her career to studying the Black middle class, demography, and racial residential segregation. Dr. Marsh's research is divided into two broad areas: avenues into the Black middle class and the consequences of being in the Black middle class. Dr. Marsh also has played lots of different roles in academic spaces. So she has served as a contributor to really esteemed media outlets like CNN and the Washington Post. She was awarded the Jacqueline Johnson Jackson Early Career Award from the Association of Black Psychologists in 2015. In 2019, Dr. Marsh was voted chair-elect of the section on race, gender, and class for the American Sociological Association. And as a Fulbright scholar in 2017, she conducted really groundbreaking research on the Black middle class in South Africa, resulting in a number of forthcoming books and international collaboration. I actually first met Dr. Marsh at a virtual conference where she spoke about her book, The Love Jones Cohort, and I really enjoyed her insights about singlehood and living alone in the Black middle class. And I'm so pleased that we get to hear more from her today. I think her work takes many interdisciplinary perspectives that we can all really learn from. So please welcome me in giving a really big round of applause to Dr. Kris Marsh, who will be talking to us today.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm super excited to be here. It's towards the end of my semester as well. So I think it's both good and bad that I'm the final speaker of the evening or the semester, because I'm the last person. So you'll remember the conversation that we'll have today or the presentation that we'll have today. But I do hope in this presentation, I give you some things to think about that really energize you as you go into the summer session. I'm also in a really great space. Like literally I'm in a really great space, but I happen to be in Nashville, Tennessee right now as we speak. I live in Maryland, Bowie, Maryland. But I'm also in a really great space academically, because any day now, and if the email comes while we're on this call, trust me, you will know, because you will see the tears meet up under my chin. Any day now, I should find out whether or not I'm going to be promoted to a full professor. I've gone through assistant. I will be the first Black woman who has gone from assistant to associate to full in my department of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park. So if that email comes through, we're going to have to stop and celebrate, because it's really a great accomplishment, but it's also extremely frustrating that I'm the first Black anything in 2024. But if the email comes through, we're going to celebrate. But I also think because I'm in this space, I'm asking myself some difficult questions, and I'm thinking about things a little bit differently and what I want the next 15 years of my academic career to look like. And I'm not really sure what it's gonna look like, but I am excited about the work that I have done, and I'm doing the kind of presentation that I want to do today. And because I say I'm doing the presentation I want to do, this is what I want to talk about and how I want to talk about it. If you're expecting this very academic talk, that's what you're not going to get today. If you want to hear about how this book came to be and the trajectory of how I got here, that's the kind of conversation I want to have. I really want to have the conversation with graduate students, because I want to show you how scholars can get from where you are to hating your research, questioning why are you even in graduate school? What does this even matter? Why does this even matter to me? To getting all the way to a book that you absolutely love and admire and adore, and people bring you out to have conversations around the book. I also, at the same time, want faculty to think about what their legacy is and what are they trying to leave in academia. And Are they doing the best by their students? So I'm going to do the talk that I want to have. My Zoom is still going to cut off at 7 o'clock. I still got to catch a plane tomorrow morning. So if you don't like my talk, that's on you. But I just want to talk a little bit with my students because I'm now the director of graduate studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. I never thought in a million years I would be the director of graduate studies, but they asked me to do it. And please don't tell my chair in my department, but I absolutely love it. I love advocating for my students. I absolutely love it. I hate all of the administrative paperwork that I have to do, but advocating for my students and trying to get my things together and in place for my students, I love that part. And so I was talking before you all got online, I was saying, you know, I turned 50 in August, and I really do admire and adore my students. But if I really admire and adore my students like I say that I do, I have to retire. I have to get out of the way and make space for young scholars to take my place. Let me tell you something I realized real quickly, and then we'll get to the presentation, I promise. This is something I realized just a couple of weeks ago. And I was like, it's so in your face. I didn't even see it. Y'all probably know this, but I did not realize this. We are one of the only industries where we don't age together. I teach a first year class. I'm having 18-year-olds every year. They're 18, I'm 50, 51, 52. They're 18, I'm 55, 56. They're 18. The gap is getting bigger. The connection is getting looser. If I say I admire and adore my students, like I really say that I do, I have to get out of the way so young scholars can come and teach the students. I will not be 70 in here still teaching my students. And the other thing I would argue is that the way I taught my students in 08 when I first started academia is not the same way I teach my students in 2024. If any, to my colleagues and scholars, if any of us are teaching the same way we taught in 08, we're doing a disservice to our students. We've got to, it's not the same student. Whether or not it's a better, worse, it is a different student today than it was in 08. And if you're still teaching the same way and you're PowerPointing them to death for an hour and a half, that's shame on you. So let me PowerPoint you to death for an hour, just an hour. Now that I said all that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about the book. Oh, the other thing that I want to say really quick is that my colleagues did not tell me this, and I'm telling everybody on this call, so you can't act like no one told you. My book is published with Cambridge University Press. Cambridge is one of the top academic presses in the world. Cambridge gets 90% of every book that I sell. My book is $30. I get $3 on every book. Let me tell you how delusional I was. I was like, with all the royalties I'm going to get from my book, I'm buying me a Rolex. Your girl can't buy a Rolex with $3 on every book. I bought a really nice, I bought the fake one off of Amazon. I'm going to buy a really nice Swatch watch. Some of y'all don't even know what a Swatch watch is. Or I'm going to buy an iPhone watch. I cannot buy a Rolex. But I did not know that you only got 10%. One of my colleagues said, I only got 6%. I was like, maybe I should start complaining about my 10%. But because I only get $3 on every book that I sell, I got to sell a lot of books. So I'm not going to tell you everything that's in the book because you got to buy the book. I want my $3. I need my $3. I want to be able to buy my iWatch full price. I don't want to put it on layaway. I want to buy a really nice edition one. So please buy my book. So I'm not going to tell you everything that's in the book because I want my $3. Now, let me PowerPoint you for an hour so I can get my $3. Okay, here we go. Can you see the PowerPoint? Can somebody tell me if you can see the PowerPoint?
No, I think you need to share your screen again.
Oh, I didn't share my screen. Okay, hold on. Let me go over here and share my screen. Where are you all? Okay, I have to share it again. Oh, that's right, because I stopped sharing. Okay. Okay. Share. Bam. Here we go. All right. So let's talk about how we got to the book. So I'm Kris Marsh. I'm from the University of Maryland, College Park, and we're talking about the Love Jones Cohort. But I want to start out with a little bit of audience participation. We're not in person, but if we were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hands. You can raise your hands on Zoom, but I want you to kind of motivate you like who I'm actually talking about when I decided to write this book. So if you or someone you know fits into these categories, I want you to raise your hand. So do you know somebody that's single? Do you know somebody that's single and living alone? Do you know somebody that's single, living alone, and college educated? Do you know somebody that's single, living alone, college educated, making good money? For any of my economists, I'll explain what that means. Raise your hand. If you know somebody that's single, living alone, college educated, making good money, and working, raise your hand. And then lastly, if you know somebody that's single, living alone, college educated, making good money, working, and is a homeowner, raise your hand. I can't see the room, but I think probably everybody knows somebody or fits in to this demographic group. But as sure as my name is Kris Marsh, as I'm being trained as a sociologist and a demographer, I don't see this group in the demographic literature. And so this motivated me. It was me. It was people that were in my network. And I was happy in my everyday lives, but it seems as if scholars weren't really aware of this or weren't really engaging with this group of people. So I really wanted to focus on this group of people in the research that I did around singlehood. And so what I did was I developed this idea of SALAs. It's so funny because I wrote a book, side note. So all my students know whenever I say a side note, it doesn't directly relate to the conversation. It's just interesting context. My book came out in February, and then the audiobook came out in April. And they sent me a thing from the narrator and said, is it SALA or is it SALA? I was like, it is SALA. So let's make sure we say SALA when we're talking about Kris Marsh and her work. So I really want to talk about people who are single and living alone in SALA households. And when I talk about SALA households, I want to talk specifically about who I'm talking about. And these are Black households I'm talking about. These are people that are aged 25 to 54. They're single. They've never been married. I was really emphatic about wanting to look at people who had never been exposed to the stimuli actually being marriage. So whenever I say single, when I'm talking about single, I'm talking about people who have never been married. Can they be in a romantic relationship? Maybe. They're just have never been exposed to the stimuli. I'm not suggesting that people that were ever married is not a group worth looking at. I mean, ever single, ever married and now single, returning to singlehood. I'm not saying that they're not an important group to look at, but what I am saying is that I just want to focus on those that are single, have never been married. I also am looking at people who may or may not live alone. And this is the quantitative work, because what I had to do is I had to build the quantitative work that laid the groundwork for the qualitative work and why I decided to write the book. So my quantitative work, I wanted people who may or may not live alone. They could have a romantic partner. They're not living with their romantic partner. So they could be in relationships. They're just simply not living with a romantic partner, but they could be living with people to pull resources together, because I live in the DC area. DC is extremely expensive. I'm from LA, which is very expensive as well. And so sometimes you have to pull resources with people to live together. I mean, you have to pull resources so that you can afford to live together. In the quantitative work that I did, I also want to look at people that were child-free. What I meant by child-free in the quantitative work is that I could tell whether or not there was a child in the house. I wasn't trying to measure fertility. I wanted to measure whether or not there was a child in the house. In the quantitative work, that's what I did. In the qualitative work, I wanted to see if you had ever had a child, and I'll explain that when we get to that part. And then again, I call this group SALA. I could have called them solo, because there's an extraordinary book that's written by Eric Kleinenberg, which talks about going solo, the extraordinary life of those that are single and extraordinary life of the single person or something. But for me, it was really clear to me that I wanted to look at people who were Black, or I wanted to have a race conversation, because what I'm kind of afraid that I'm seeing in the singlehood literature is that the singlehood literature, somebody is so not muted. The singlehood literature doesn't really, it kind of has like a white face and a white gaze. And I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose the race conversation in the conversation about singlehood. Side note, I tend to talk fast. So if I talk fast, it puts up in the chat to let me know to slow down. But I'm 50. I told y'all I'm 50. I'm going to use profanity for illustration purposes. One of my dearest girlfriend, Jackie Pierce, told me, once you turn 50, you give 0 fucks. I am 50 and I give 0 fucks. So I'm not going to own that I talk fast. What I'm going to own is that y'all listen slowly, and I do talk a little fast. So if I slow down a little bit and y'all listen a little faster, we will get through this together. But if I am talking too fast for you, or you can't listen fast enough, put it in the chat and I will slow down. But if not, I'm going to stay pretty much at this speed. So I was really interested in looking at people that were single and living alone, who have pretty much been ignored in the literature. Now, with that being said, here's one of the only times you will see me do any kind of interracial comparison. Let me tell you, there's one thing that I decided early on in there's 2 things I decided early on in my academic career, and it's really important to me. The first thing that I decided is that I was not going to pimp the poor to make my academic career. There are a lot of scholars who do not look like me, who have spent their entire time talking about the ills in poor Black America, and I was not going to produce that kind of scholarship. The other thing that I decided early on in my academic career is that I didn't want to do a lot of interracial racial comparisons. When you do a lot of interracial comparison, the reference group is usually white. The gold standard is usually white. There is enough variation in Black America where I can do intra-racial comparisons. I don't have to do interracial comparisons because there's enough variation. Now that I've said that, I'm going to completely and totally contradict myself in this slide right here. So in this slide, this is the percentage of, let me move that over there. This is the percentage of Black and white adults that have never married between the ages of 25 and 65 from 1880 to 2019. And I'm not sure exactly what happened between the 50s and the 60s. But if you look at it, if you look towards the end of the graph, you can see that Blacks actually dominate the conversation. And so, like I said before, I kind of feel like singlehood has taken a white face and a white gaze, but Black people have been doing this for quite some time and doing it in a high percentage. And in fact, Black women have been doing this for quite some time. That part of the reason why I wrote the book is I wanted to pay respect and homage to Black women who have done this. And I wanted to make sure that Black women got their flowers. Whether or not it's an adaptation, Black women have been doing singlehood for quite some time. And it was really important for me to make that conversation, have that conversation. So anything else will not be an interracial comparison, but I just want to make sure you understood why I could write a whole book just on Black singles. Okay. So with that being said, here's one of the things I had to realize, and I appreciate the introduction because it said, like, I've dedicated my career to looking at avenues into the Black middle class and consequences of being a Black middle class. And as I started as a young scholar, I really wanted to understand the Black middle class. And there was a subtle argument that I was seeing in the literature. And the subtle argument in the literature was that the Black middle class was shrinking. And part of the reason why the Black middle class was shrinking, or there's a decrease in Black middle class, is because there was a decrease in married couple households with children. So that meant that led to a decrease in the Black middle class. But I was arguing that there's an alternative view and an alternative way we should be thinking about the Black middle class. And I was suggesting we're seeing an increase in SALAs. We're still seeing a decrease in married couple households, but that doesn't mean that we're not seeing a decrease in the Black middle class. In fact, we're seeing an increase, or the Black middle class is stabilizing itself by married, single, and living alone households. So there's a demographic shift in the Black middle class away from married couples to young Black professionals who aren't married and don't have any children. So it's short-sighted to say that the Black middle class is decreasing itself. So, So one of the things I had to decide is like, okay, how am I going to be able to measure the Black middle class to see if there really is this demographic shift? So one of the things I had to do was I had to look at the social science literature and look at the variables that have typically been used for measuring middle class status. The typical variables that are used are education, occupation, and income. Over the last 30 years or so, we started to see more data around wealth and thinking about how wealth plays into the conversation about middle class. And I'm thinking about the seminal piece that was written by Black Wealth, White Wealth by Oliver and Shapiro. And it talks about the fragility of the Black middle class. But if the world stops on its axis, like it did with COVID, and you don't have assets, how are you going to be able to sustain your middle class status? So these are the four variables I had to decide that I wanted to use, because I wanted to be sensitive to what the literature was saying, but I had to figure out how I wanted to actually use these variables. So when I look at all of these variables and I look at the comparisons between white and Blacks, it makes another argument for why I want to make a Black middle class index that's relative to Blacks, not relative in relation to whites. I want to make a Black middle class measure that measures Blackness and Black middle classness, not interracial comparison. Also, related to that, if you look at the homeownership percentage for Blacks in 2010, in the book, I talk about how the homeownership rates for Blacks is similar to what it was post-civil rights. So was that a conversation about Blacks just don't know how to save, Blacks just don't know how to be homeowners, or is it a structural conversation? I would argue it's absolutely a structural conversation. And I, in the book, talk ad nauseum about how structure is a part of this conversation, and we need to include structure in the conversation, because I am a sociologist. Okay. So since I didn't want to do an interracial comparison, I was like, okay, I'm going to build a Black middle class index. I called it the BMCI. Now, again, this is all of the quantitative foundation I'm putting for the qualitative work. So I use census data, I use ACS, I looked at various households, I looked at ages 25 to 54 and 25 to 44. And I also looked race specific. It was an index of relative to Black households. And it was really important that I did that. But let's look at what the variables that we actually used. We used educational attainment. So I looked at all Black households, 25 to 54. If anybody had a bachelor's degree or beyond, you got a 1 on the index. I looked at wealth. If you were owning the home, you got a 1 on the, if you were buying or owning the home, you got a 1. If your occupational prestige score was above the median, I think for all Black households, you received a 1 on the index. And then lastly, I wanted to look at per person income because I wanted to look at people how much each person had to spend in the household, because I was looking at households of different sizes. What's really interesting about the Black index, people often say, well, if you would have taken the wealth indicator out, you probably would have had more people that would have shown up as Black middle class. And that's actually not true. Education was the hardest variable to load on, not homeownership. But what is important is that I'm a big Aretha Franklin fan. So let's just say we use the person Aretha. If someone named Aretha has a master's degree, they're a marketing executive and they make $250,000, but they're renting a lofty apartment in downtown DC, but don't own it, they would not show up in the data set as middle class. I'm not putting a value judgment on homeownership, but what I am doing is being sensitive to the literature. And the literature talks about the fragility of the Black middle class. So I wanted to have some kind of wealth measure. If I would have relax the educational standard, I would have so many more people that showed up in the area as showed up as Black middle class. So let's look at the data. If we look at the data in 1980, only 6% of Black households, 25 to 54, would be middle class based on my Black middle class index. If you look at 2010, you're looking at about 13%. I carry the conversation and the data forward in the book, but it's still, the Black middle class are still a small segment of the pie of Black households, but they are a part of the pie. And because they are a part of the pie, they're important to be studied, and I will continue to study them. Okay, so I wrote an article in Social Forces, and it talked about the percent distribution of Black middle class households. 2 bars I want to draw your attention to, the white bars and the black bars. The white bars are the married couple households with children. And you can see from 1980 until 2000, I carried the conversation forward in the book. You can see that the percentage of people that are single, married couple household with children is decreasing from one decade to the next. The percentage is getting smaller. You can also see the bottom, which are the black bars. You can also see that those that are single and living alone is increasing from one decade to the next. If we were to take another snapshot of the data, looking at people that are single and living alone in the Black middle class, you can see that each year, the percentage is actually growing or kind of sustaining itself from one year to the next. If we were to juxtapose the people that are single and living alone with those with married with children, we can see that at some point, the argument might be made that we might have a crossover, a convergence and a crossover, where married couple households aren't the largest household type in the Black middle class, but single and living alone could possibly be the largest household in the Black middle class if the trend continues in this direction. So this is the kind of quantitative foundation that I've laid. I then wanted to say, okay, I built the numerical models. I've done the statistical work. I've done the synthetic cohort analyses. I want to extend the conversation in a different way. And I even say in the book that this book, I tried to put metaphorical meat on the numeric bones that I built over the first part of my academic career. As a demographer, it's one thing to talk about the trends. It's another thing to put meat and skin and bones on these numeric trends that I built in the first part of my career. Hence, I decided to write a book about people that are single and living alone in the Black middle class. But if we think about the quintessential Black middle class or upper Black middle class family, we often default to the Huxtables on the Cosby Show. But about 26 years ago, there was a movie that came out, and the movie was called Love Jones. And in this movie, you see a demographic shift away from married couples to young Black professionals who aren't married and don't have any children. So that's how I came with the title of the Love Jones Cohort. I wanted to draw from the movie, but I also wanted to draw from my demographic training and use the word cohort. So that's how we came up with the title. For some people, and people often think that I'm talking about the storyline in Love Jones, the movie. It's not about the storyline. It's about the characters in the movie. For some of us on this call, we may have seen Love Jones. For others of us, we've never seen the movie. But I do, for just one moment, want to entertain you with a small trailer that talks briefly.
Okay, the Billy D thing is a little played out, but I will give you 10 cool points for nostalgia's sake. I am not trying to meet another man at this time. You and I should get together sometime and have a drink. I don't think that'll be a very good idea.
Hey,
Persistence.
be surprised how far I can get you.
Phone. Put it on. But you get a friend of mine, Tracy Powell.
Hi.
What? You married?
Oh, wait, if my memory serves me correctly, you were the one that told me not to get married.
I did say that. But I also said the Commodores would get back together. Me, who knew?
What I need is to find a man who's not scared of my power.
That's ladies, what's up? One thing, I don't need poetry to get women.
No, you need a personality to get women.
Try a breath mint and a visa.
New Line Cinema presents
It's what you make and with whom you make.
I don't know, man. It defies description. Whatever it was, man, she put it on.
Girl, the man wears sex like a coat.
Lorenz Tate, Nia Long, Lisa Nicole Carson, Isaiah Washington, and Bill Bellamy.
Sometimes a man just want to be held, cuddled a little bit. Please.
In a film about making,
All we ask is a little sex on demand. You
breaking,
wait about your daddy, baby.
and putting it all together.
This is nothing serious. This is not a love.
Love Jones.
Yes.
Wait a minute. You made breakfast.
On a side note, if you all could even imagine how rewarding it feels to bring a staple item that's in Black American culture to these conversations, I think you'd be super duper excited and happy for me. Okay, so this leads me to me writing the book about people that are single and living alone in the Black middle class that I titled The Love Jones Cohort. On a side note, I think it's really great to write an interesting title book because one of my colleagues who was in criminology, he won the Stockholm Prize. And he called me, he's like, oh my gosh, Kris, I saw your book in the library and I'm so excited to figure out what the title means. And I just bought a copy of it. I was like, cha-ching, $3 more for me. So let me tell you a little bit about the book and why I wrote the book and why I think you might want to be, might get interested and excited to buy the book. The book draws from 3 theoretical frameworks. The first one is stratification economics. In its most basic sense, stratification economics offers a structural rather than a behavioral explanation for economic inequality between socially identified groups. I'm taking stratification economics conversation, and I'm extending that conversation out to singlehood. And one of the things I think is really important about singlehood is that from a sociological perspective, I know a lot of us, we have a lot of psychologists on the call, but from a sociological perspective, we often leave singlehood at the individual level and think people have done something wrong. And people that are single will be like, woe is me, something is wrong with me. But I am trying to argue that we have to understand singlehood from a structural perspective. And so put differently, I say that structural forces constrain personal choices, especially in Black America. Structural or systemic forces constrain personal choices. If I were to say that differently, I would say racism constrains personal choices. If I were to back that up with an example, if I, Kris Marsh, want to marry another partner with another heterosexual Black man who has a PhD, owns his own home, makes $250,000 and has estate planning, he's simply not there. So whether or not I'm single by choice or by force, I can't lose sight of the conversation that my dating pool is constrained before I even decide to date the people that I am choosing to date or not to date. But if we're not careful, we'll just keep at the individual level. I also wrote the book because I want to destigmatize singlehood, because people just don't want to hold the title of single, that they'll end up in relationships that are oppressive, toxic, unfulfilling, and even abusive because they don't want to hold the title of single. So I'm trying to destigmatize singlehood, but I'm also trying to offer a structural perspective. Secondly, I think intersectionality. And when I initially wrote the book, I thought I was going to get a lot of pushback in the book. So in the very basic sense, intersectionality is saying, like, you can't just look at Kris Marsh as Black. You can't just look at Kris Marsh as a woman. You have to look at Kris Marsh as a Black woman and how that factors into the conversation. I am arguing that it's not just race, class, and gender, but it's race, class, gender, and singleism. So Kris Marsh is a Black single woman. And what are all the nuances that come into that and play with that? And I thought people were gonna be like, oh, you can't add singlehood to the conversation, but people are like, I'm about it, let's do it. So I'm like, I don't get pushback. I will tell you shortly where I do get pushback. And then last one is respectability politics. And this is kind of the assumption that Black people should conform with mainstream. That means translation white, manners, behaviors, and appearances to fit in better with the larger society, and meaning the white society. And so I'm wondering if people in the Love Jones cohort feel like they have to get married or there's pressure for them to get married to be more accepted in the larger society. So those are the kind of theoretical frameworks that are wrapped around the book. Okay, so Here's where I would probably talk about some findings in each book, but I really want to just entice you to pick up the book. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how each chapter is laid out, then I'll talk about how we actually collected the data. So in chapter 1, there's a scholarly debate on how the Black middle class is defined, because the definition is evolving, it's constantly evolving. Is it subjective? Is it objective? You know, it's a whole big conversation. So that really, if you're really interested in finding out about how the Black middle class is defined in class versus status, you would really enjoy chapter 1. Chapter 2 specifically asks the Love Jones cohort how they define the Black middle class. Because if we look at the scholarship often either directly or indirectly suggests, implicit or explicitly, express that you need to be married, you need to be a husband, a wife, 2.5 kids, and a black picket fence. That's kind of like this heteronormative idea of middle classness. Because these people are saying that they're middle class, but they're not partnered, they're not married, and they don't have children. I was curious to know how they define the Black middle class. So that chapter really talks about that. The chapter 3 is about the Love Jones cohort and the Black middle class identity. Two things that I did in the book. The introduction in chapter 1 are very theoretically dense. Chapter 2 through 10 are not as theoretically dense. And I really was trying to write the book for a lay audience, but the publisher, Cambridge, was like, oh, we are Cambridge, and you will write a theoretical section if you want to publish with us. And I was like, oh, will I? Okay, I did. The other thing that I did, I have an editor. Anybody that does any writing probably should have an editor. People don't always say they have editors. I have an editor for every single thing. I'm not embarrassed by it, and I tell everybody that I have an editor. I also have a therapist I see every Monday at 10 o'clock too. But and my editor said, Kris, sometimes you go off on a tangent. Can you imagine me going off on a tangent? Come on, you've only been on the call for 30 minutes, but do you see me going off on a tangent? But I digress. He said, if you find yourself going off on a tangent, put things in a footnote, but try to keep footnotes to a bare minimum. I had 120 footnotes because I had some tangents I wanted to go off on in the book. Now, in this chapter, we talked about Black middle class identity and what responsibility Black middle class have to the larger Black community. And of course, if you're having that conversation, it's probably going to come up. W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of the talented 10th will probably come up. In a very basic sense, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the talented 10th, 10% of the Black population, will uplift all of Black America. But he actually, what's funny is that W.E.B. Du Bois actually pushed back on his own idea later on in life. But here's where I, as a Black female scholar, could not leave the conversation there. I had to be sensitive to what my respondents said. And my respondents talked about Black middle class identity, and they talked about responsibility to the larger community. But I also put a footnote in this chapter because it was important to me to understand that while they talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, there was another scholar at the same time who was talking about Black middle class, about uplifting Black America. And if you wanted to uplift Black America, uplift Black women, and that'll improve life chances for everybody. And that scholar's name was Anna Julia Cooper. Most people don't know who Anna Julia Cooper is. One of the first Black women to get a PhD. The reason why they don't know Anna Julia Cooper is because there were gatekeepers that were preventing her work to get published because she was a Black woman. And one of the gatekeepers happened to be W.E.B. Du Bois. The academic rumor is that he actually plagiarized some of her work later on in life. So that's a really interesting chapter about how the Love Jones cohort think about their responsibility to the larger Black community. The rise of never married singles. This was a really interesting chapter to write, and I try to get the Love Jones cohort to tell me why might be the rise in never married Black singles. And in that chapter, we talk about dating, we talk about online dating, we talked about interracial dating, we talked about the racism and sexism that exists in online dating. We talked about whether or not it's a economic thing, whether or not it's like a value thing. It's a really interesting chapter. I think you'll find a lot of value in the chapter, but there's no one reason why there's a rise in never married Black singles. It's a compilation of explanations. And then again, I asked them whether or not they're single by choice, circumstance, or an amalgamation of both. And it's really funny because in this chapter, a lot of the people talked about how, I'm single by choice, but then they talked about how like bad experiences in dating, like, oh, this one guy was this crazy, this one woman did this, blah, blah, blah. And then they said that they chose to be single. But regardless of they chose to be single or it's by choice, circumstance, and amalgamation, this chapter, I really try to drive the point home is that your dating pool is constrained before you're deciding to engage in the dating pool. And that's what chapter 5 does. In chapter 6, I really like chapter 6 because here's what comes up in this chapter. And I think two things come up in this chapter I think are fabulous to the overall conversation about singles. One is about the freedom. They have the freedom to do whatever they want to do. but they also talked about how friends play a central role in their lives as single. In particular, the Black women really talked about the friendship, and how friendship played a central role, a central cast member in their lives as single. The Black men did not talk about it as much. In fact, some of the Black men talked about wanting to have non-romantic, nurturing relationships with other men, but people might think that they're quote unquote soft, or people might think that they're gay. And so I do hope that after reading this book, we can normalize having non-romantic, nurturing relationships among Black men. I really wanted to have a conversation about intergenerational mobility and the dissemination of wealth, because if we look at the social science literature, class status is usually transferred from parent to child, and a lot of these people had assets. So I really wanted to know who they were going to disseminate their wealth to and how they were going to disseminate their wealth, which becomes a really thoughtful conversation, because I'm so tired of having this conversation. Why aren't Black women getting married? Demographically, we know that that's the case. What we don't know is how they're navigating their singleness and how they're making some of these decisions. So the book wanted to talk through some of those decisions, like when are they choosing to buy a home, and how are they choosing to accumulate wealth? These are the questions that I think really push the conversation forward, as opposed to why aren't you getting married? I also want to know about neighborhood decisions and interaction. I want to know how likely they were to interact with their neighbors, especially because they're single. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give you some general findings about that. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about health, mental well-being, and coping strategies. And I co-authored this with a mentee who's now a professor in UCLA in the School of Public Health. So briefly, I'll talk about the data. So we collected the data over the summer of 2015. We recruited for people in the DMV, and that's really important, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, because the conversation comes up, and I've left so many conversations to be had based on this book. It's like, does the Love Jones Cohort as a book hold up in the Deep South? Does it hold up in the Northwest? Does it hold up on the West Coast? So it is specific to the DC area. Interviews lasted from about an hour to an hour and a half. Some interviews were 45 minutes and some were over 3 hours. We asked the respondents where they wanted to be, where they wanted to engage in the interview. Most respondents said that the university was fine, or a coffee shop or something, which is always a horrible place because it's so loud in a coffee shop. So we try to find quiet places to do the interviews. They were compensated. I honestly don't remember. I think it was $15. It really wasn't a lot of money. And then we asked for a snowball sample. So at the end of the interview, we asked if they could give us the names and numbers of 5 other people that fit into this demographic. And that's how we built our data set. So we originally had, I don't think I said that part, parity. We had gender and racial parity. Well, gender, because the race was all Black. So we had the young women interview the young women, and we had the young men interview the young men. We settled on 62 respondents, 43 were women and 19 were men. The age range was 25 to 64. We tried to recruit for older adults. We didn't do the best job of getting much older adults. And the average age was slightly under 40. Everybody was from the DMV. Everybody just defined themselves as Black middle class. All of them were never married, and none of them had children. And most of them, over 50%, had $100,000 worth of wealth. And usually that was going to be their equity in their home, where they actually had most of their wealth. So like, here are some of the questions that we asked, like, what factors led you to choose to live in this neighborhood? How important was it for you to choose to live in a neighborhood based on your relationship status? So safety and neighborly interactions were 2 of the findings that came up in chapter 9. So let's talk briefly about safety and Deborah. So Deborah's estimated age is about 50. She loves to travel to new places and to cook. She works at her alma mater and was previously employed in DC. Deborah said, because I wanted to live in a neighborhood where I felt safe, where I could come here at any time. You're by yourself, so there's no one to come and rescue you. So safety was important for me. That was Deborah. Put a little differently, Joseph, who's 21, is a software specialist who enjoys researching new information during his spare time through books and computers, writes that I work on computers, so that's a big thing. I want to make sure that my equipment's safe. My unit is good. It has a locked front door. So safety is something I could check off. So if you notice, it feels like Deborah talks more so about her physical safety, and Joseph speaks more so about his material, the safety of his material objects. So that's kind of like, and I'm really glad that I included men. I wasn't going to initially include men in the book, but I'm so glad that I did, because subtle differences showed up for men versus women. Then I wanted to know like how much they interacted with their neighbors, because they're single versus neighbors who are married. And nearly 50 of them lived in family-oriented neighborhoods, which is really interesting, because you might think that, okay, you're single, you don't have children, you don't have a partner, you might want to live in these really great downtown-like areas where it's vibrant life, nightlife. A lot of them lived in bedroom communities because they really want to get they were savvy business people. They want to get the best bang for their buck. and 62% never or rarely interacted with their neighbors. So we draw from Alexis. Alexis was 31. She was a human resource manager and worked her way up from an intern, and her hobbies included running and traveling. And Alexis acquiesces that she has more regular interactions with her neighbors. It's probably an artifact of her having dogs. And so she said, I have a dog who's like my child, and this is a big dog community. They know his name before they know my name. It's like, oh, you're Encino's mom. It's like, yeah, hey, that's my social life right here, walking my dog. So she doesn't really interact much, but the interactions that she does have really is based on the dog. But then Lafayette, which I thought was really interesting, took a slightly different approach. So Lafayette, who's 52, enjoys skiing, golfing, and plays a musical instrument and works from home for a technology company. He was like, single woman, question mark. The neighborhood wants to probably help out. Make sure to keep an eye on her. Single man, question mark. I think people, for the most part, they don't want to get too close for whatever reason. There is a stigma with creepy single dude. They should be avoided at all costs, while single woman needs to be protected and looked after. And here's a shameless plug. It's funny because people were dragging Tim Scott. Tim Scott is a senator somewhere in the South, and he was single, and people were dragging him, and they thought of his singlehood as a deficit in some kind of way. So I got an email from MSNBC asking me, do I know who Tim Scott is? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, will you write a blog about Tim Scott? And I was like, I don't get down with his politics at all. They're like, no, write a blog about his singlehood. And people like drug him and talked about how he was so inadequate to be a candidate for presidency because he was single. But we got some presidents that are married that didn't do a good job. Maybe we do need to have a single president. We've had one before, but maybe we need to go back to having another single president. But I was having a bad day. They called me, they said they want this in like 48 hours. I was like, if you want something in 48 hours, I'm gonna give you Kris unfiltered. So if you want to see Kris Marsh mad and unfiltered, you might want to check out that blog. It still should be up. I think I wrote it in September or October. Okay, but Alexis is talking about how she doesn't really interact much with the neighbors, but if she does, it's because of the dog. And then Lafayette was like, I don't really do much because I'm a single man and people have a certain kind of idea about single men, so I don't really interact. So those are just some of the general kind of findings that show up in the book. So one of the things I think is really important when we think about the neighborhood chapter, which I think is chapter 9, is generally the Salos were unconcerned with what their neighbors thought of them and how they regarded them. But it did seem as if their Sala status did play a role into how they decided to choose certain kind of neighborhoods. And so they weren't concerned about them, but their status did have some bearing on where they decided to live and why they decided to live where they want to live. But if we draw back and look at some of the larger conclusions from what I'm really trying to get people to think about is from the book, again, I said this earlier, and this was really important to me. We have to understand that in a lot of ways, I think Black people and Black women in particular have been trailblazers, whether or not it's an adaptation or not. But Black women in a lot of ways have been trailblazers, and they've opened up the opportunity. They've shown the world how to do singlehood and how to do it in an efficient and effective kind of way. And so I do want to make sure that we don't lose focus of the Black women in this entire conversation. Again, I want to return to the conversation of choice versus circumstance and how it really can be an amalgamation of both. But regardless of the amalgamation of both, we can't lose sight of how structural forces have constrained people's personal choices, especially Black American and especially Black American women. Here's where I remember I said earlier, I didn't get a lot of pushback, but I do get pushback somewhere. Here's where I get a lot of pushback. If you buy my argument that structural forces constrain personal choices, and then you don't allow me to be defined as a family, you're discriminating against me in plain sight. If we look at the Census Bureau definition of a family is someone that you're related to by blood, marriage, or adoption. In the US, the Census Bureau is like the air quotes, gold standard of data. And they say that to be a family, you have to be related by blood, marriage, or adoption. So Kris Marsh, because I live alone and I'm not partner, I don't have children, I would not show up in the census data as a family. I would show up in the census data as a household. If you believe that structural forces constrain my personal choices, and then you don't allow me to be defined as a family, I do believe that you're discriminating against me in plain sight. Let me give you 3 examples. One's benign and one's more egregious. I have a Verizon cell phone. I don't know if y'all have Verizon out there, but I have a Verizon cell phone. I want the family plan on my Verizon cell phone. I want to play a discounted rate on my family plan of Kris Marsh, one person family rate. Benign example. As I said before, I'm the director of graduate studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. And as soon as my semester is over, I'm going on vacation somewhere with some water. But a single occupancy is more expensive than a double occupancy, slightly more benign. Here's one where everybody's head should shake when I mention it out loud. The tax structure. There is a singlehood penalty built into the tax structure. There's a great book by Dorothy Brown. One of the things that she argues is that it's called The Whiteness of Wealth. And one of the things she argues that everybody should file their taxes as single. And I agree with Dorothy Brown, but if we can't file our taxes as single, Kris Marsh, want to file my taxes as a Marsh family and get my family discount in the tax structure. So we have to think about family. Now, one of my colleagues talked to me for 2.5 hours raved about the book. And she's like, I just want to bring something to your attention, Kris, real quick before we get off the phone. So I was like, okay. She's like, I don't think you're arguing for a family. I don't think you care about family. I think you care about people getting the advantages that families get, but you don't care about a title. And I was like, actually, I really don't. I don't care if you change the title. I really do care that people that are single, because of structural forces that they could have possibly been single, they're not disadvantaged and they get all the advantages that families have. I don't care about the title per se, but I do care about the advantages and disadvantages. And then lastly, I don't know if I said this, but I want to make sure, I think I said this, but if I didn't say, I want to say it here. One of the things that was really important to me when I wrote this book, and I thought I said this, but I say it in the book, in the preface, this is a politics of citation. And what I mean by that is that I want to cite Black scholars talking about Black families. There are people who have made their entire career talking about Black families who do not look like me, and they are considered the expert because they're not in the community. There are Black scholars who have been talking about Black families who are saying the exact same things that white scholars are saying. I'm using white and Black for binary purposes. That white scholars are saying, but they never even get the visibility because the white scholars thought of being more of an expert on Black family. So I did not want to write that kind of scholarship, and I wanted to pay homage and respect to Black scholars who have been making these same arguments for years. There's an anthropologist who spent and did an ethnography in a Black community, Black family, and wrote a stellar book. It's a really great book, but she becomes the expert on extended Black family. And I was like, I'm not going to cite their work because there's another scholar who was writing before her who was making similar arguments that they were making. And that scholar is Andrew Billingsley. And Andrew Billingsley talks about augmented family. And this is when you have people that are like social cousins or extended family. We should be able to have like a policy in place where they're actually acknowledged in policy as a form of a family so that they can get the benefits of family. Again, you have to understand that structural forces constrain personal choices, and some people aren't able to partner and aren't able to marry. That doesn't mean that they can't pool their resources with friends or extended family and be identified in policies as an augmented family and get those family benefits. So those are the broader conclusions that the book is really trying to make. Now, I want to leave you with 6 quick questions that also appear in the back of the book, and then we'll open it up for questions more broadly. Having listened to the talk that I just gave and the trajectory on how I wrote this book and what were some of my goals in this book, I want to pose a couple of questions at you. The first one is it elitist to ask the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If your question is based on the premise that having a spouse or partner and children is the ultimate measure of success, then my answer is yes. Number 2, is it demeaning to ask the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If in asking your questions, the onus is placed solely at the boots of the Love Jones cohort without consideration to structural forces and our agentic individual choice and preferences, then my answer is yes. Number 3, is it insensitive to ask the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If in asking your question, all other life accomplishments are ignored and or it is assumed that their status is purely due to choice rather than out of necessity or circumstance, then my answer is yes. Number 4, is it discriminatory to ask the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If comparable questions are not asked of married people, such as, why are you married with children? We always ask single folks, why are you single? But we do not ask the complementary question to married folks, why are you married? Then yes. And or if your question assumes that the dating practices and sex lives of the cohort should be open to public consumption while discussion of the marital bed is taboo, then my answer is yes. Number 6, is it problematic to be uninformed on how structural forces shape individual behavioral choices before asking the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If your question is based on the assumption that singleness is solely due to some form of personality deficit, rather than individual choice and or without any regard to structural impediments, then my answer is yes. And lastly, is it provoking attention within the Black middle class to ask the Love Jones cohort, why are you single and child-free? If the assumption underlying your question is that only a certain household type is acceptable when it comes to membership of the Black middle class or being a valued member of society more generally, then my answer is a resounding yes. Really quick, I want to talk about the cover of the book, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So here's all of my information. If you want to reach out to me, you can absolutely reach out to me. I wouldn't give you my cell phone number if I didn't expect you to use it. Oh, wait, are y'all like international calls? Don't call me on my cell phone. You better text me. Okay. But as I told you, I was born August 1973. I was dating this guy, and we were in Chickamauga, Georgia, because his grandmother passed away. And we were cleaning out her house, and they assigned some closet for me to clean out. And as soon as I opened up her closet, this is the first magazine that fell out, and it says The Black Middle Class. If you look in the lower left-hand corner of the magazine cover, this was published August 1973, the month and year that I was born. I was like, this will be the cover of my book. Mind you, the book was 7 years delayed. So I was like, I just got to get this book out at this point. I don't have time to talk to Ebony Magazine and get the copyrights and so on and so forth. So, excuse me. So the publishing house, Cambridge, gave me some open source pictures that I could use. I was looking at all the pictures. I was trying to decide. So I saw all these really great illustrations of like Black people, like sitting out at a coffee shop, doing individuals at a coffee shop, an individual doing yoga, an individual shopping, an individual walking a dog. And then these beautiful Black women with these really thick, beautiful lips and real thick, natural hair and big earrings. And then I was like, well, let me just do my due diligence and look at all of the illustrators. Not one of the illustrators was Black. And I was like, in good conscience, I cannot put a non-Black illustrator on the cover of this book. When I'm talking all this stuff about, yeah, this is a politics citation. I was like, yeah, no. So I went to the African American Museum, and they had open source pictures, and I found a quilt. So the cover of the book, I don't have to write on me. The cover of the book is a quilt of a Black woman. It's a quilt. It's a Black woman who used to live in Anacostia, DC. She would bring young Black and brown kids to her house and teach them how to quilt. I'm so happy that I decided not to go with the illustration, because the quilt also speaks to one of the major findings in the work that talks about how friends and friendship networks really help make singlehood much easier. So that's why I decided on the cover of the book, and I'm so incredibly happy with the cover of the book that I did choose. There we go. There it is. So that's about an hour, and now I'm going to officially take a breath. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I don't think I took
so
one.
much.
Okay, my pleasure.
That was awesome. I will now sort of open it up and see if anyone has any questions for Dr. Marsh. You can feel free to unmute or raise your hand or pop any questions in the chat box.
I know I did not cover everything. So while you're thinking about questions, I want to kind of say something else, which loosely relates to the book, but I think it's really kind of interesting. So again, like for me, like I was saying, I didn't want to put illustrators on the book who weren't Black or weren't Black illustrators. That was kind of important to me. It's just a decision that I made. But also, I think I try to be about it as much as I possibly can. And I don't know, especially anybody that studies family, I don't know if anybody knows who Allison Felix is. Allison Felix is a runner in America, and she actually went to the University of Southern California. So Allison Felix first of all, when Allison Felix found out she was pregnant, she used to train in the dark and train late at night or early in the morning because she didn't want her trainers to know that she was pregnant. Mind you, pregnant. I didn't say disabled or anything like that, pregnant. When she told Nike she was pregnant, they decreased her contract by 70%. Allison Felix dropped Nike and made her own shoe line. I have her shoe in every single color. Every time a new shoe comes out, I Allison Felix Nike. I used to wear Allison Felix shoes. I used to wear Nike. I cannot in good conscience wear a Nike now. I will not wear a Nike. So she actually is pregnant now, and she's so happy because she had a daughter that she was hiding for so long, but now her and the daughter are celebrating the new son that's on the way. Allison Felix also had a t-shirt that just, a sweatshirt that just came out a couple of weeks ago. Oh, it's the first Black woman who owns a shoe line, and it's made for women specifically. Now, she also explicitly says that she has a sexist policy. I've never had children, but people say when you have children, sometimes your feet will grow. You can return your shoes or the next size up when your feet grow, no questions asked. I'm neither going to confirm nor deny whether I asked one of my girlfriends for one of her sonograms, wherever it is, I can go get me a new. Or then I was like, do I want to have a baby at 50 to get a free pair of shoes? There's things we will do for a free pair of shoes. But okay, and then as you're thinking about your question, Allison Felix also came up with a shirt that just came out like about a month ago, and I bought it as soon as it came out. And it said, "Pay me like a white man." If anybody is interested in getting looks, good and bad, wear that through an airport and see what people have to say. I have it in my suitcase right now. Let me tell you what the biggest compliment I get though. When a couple of white men came up to me and they're like, "I appreciate that." And I was like, "Bet, thank you." And like the Black women, they just walk past, they're like, "Girl, we have a whole conversation without saying a word with each other, not one word." Okay, so as I was talking, I think we have a hand up somewhere. Jason, I think? Yes.
So I'll be asking the question. I'm Brittany. We're doing this together, so yeah. A question. Like, got your book when I heard about an ARR like a while back, and I've read, and it's great. I just wonder, like, since putting out the books and doing some talks, do you have any sort of thoughts about like things you wish you had added, or things that you're thinking about, like, oh, like that's a feedback that I wish I had put in, or anything like that that's kind of changed in the time?
There's so much I just didn't make in the book. I probably have enough to write another book, but I want to get out the way. So like, it really is my closing salutation to the area. I'm opening up space for other people to do work. One of the things that I think is really interesting with the book, and I think it was in a footnote, I don't remember now. I admit my biases, I guess you want to say. I don't know if that's the right word, but the singles didn't talk about sex. They didn't talk about, and I was like, do I have to say anything to the audience? But I was like, why do I have to say anything? So I called I called the Bella DePaulos. I was like, "Bella, I need help. What should I do? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." So I thought about it, and I was like, okay, if I acknowledge that they didn't say anything about sex, then I'm saying that singles talk a lot about sex. Or I also might be conflating being promiscuous with singlehood. But to not talk about it, somebody's gonna say, "But what happened to sex? You didn't say anything." So I think I ended up putting in a footnote that of the 62 people that I interviewed, only 2 people talked about sex. They talked about it in very tangential kind of ways. It wasn't central to the conversation. And so I could have made that argument a little bit stronger, because not in academic spaces. I've talked about this book in many spaces. I talked in a couple of non-academic spaces, and people are so they've got this pervasive idea that singles out here is having sex. We just out here just getting it, right? And so they were like, "Well, Dr. Marsh, you just didn't ask the right questions." I was like, "Excuse me?" So they're so baffled. They're like, it's not that it just didn't come up. Like, oh my God, I'm just not a good researcher, and I didn't ask the right questions. I was like, yeah, I wish I would have had more conversation about the fact that it didn't come up. And I would have liked to have included that more so in the book. Because I really think, if I remember, I think it only made it in a footnote. Yeah, that's what I really would have liked to have more conversation about. Yeah. And then a lot of the people also talked about how religion played into like their choices. And as a Black woman who is a woman of faith, I was really hopeful that like Black churches would have me come out, and I'd like on the Black church circuit to talk about the book. Not nary a Black church has not. And I'm like, because I think I'm actually quite critical of these institutions and how like they think about singlehood. And I didn't think I was going to be as critical. Again, I said this is a different book post George Floyd. If I would have wrote the book before George Floyd, I'm not sure I had the conversation. We was in the house. It was COVID. We ain't had nothing but time. And I was like, and I'm feeling some kind of way. I'm still stuck in this house. So I'm feeling some kind of way. So I really wish I would have been able to talk. I'm still hopeful that the churches might have me, but I'm indicting them to think, Black institutions and institutions at large, to think largely about the way in which they engage with single, and how they think about them as such, like as the other. And they other them, and they're the attack on group. So the whole conversation about sex, I really would have liked to have had more centrally located in the book, and so people don't question me like I'm just a poor researcher.
That's really interesting. That's one of those topics, singlehood and sex, that I just find extremely interesting. But I'll leave it for other people to answer questions. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the question. Anybody else?
This is not a question, but I'll just highlight a comment in the chat from my honors student, Hilary Cho. She says, Dr. Marsh, I just wanted to share that I cited you in my honors thesis.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I was like, listen, I do not come from a line of academics. I'm the only one in my family that is an academic. And so it never gets old when people cite you. I remember one time, it never gets old when you see somebody holding your book in their hand. That never gets old to me. I was in North Carolina. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was doing a book talk. And it was like one of my first book talks. And somebody walked in with my book, and I like looked at my purse, like, wait a minute, where's my book? I was like, oh my God, you can go to the store and like buy my book. It was like tears to my eyes. It's so good to see somebody else on the book. And well, who was it? Somebody held up the book earlier today, and I was like, oh, yeah, that part never, ever, ever gets old. And all the academics that act like it's no big deal, they care. I'm saying it. They care. It matters. It absolutely matters. Yeah, it matters. Like, oh yeah, you have my book. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, my book. Thank you. So thank you for signing my book. Here's one thing I hope that at the end, oh, Hillary gave me a little heart. Here's one thing that I hope. I hope, if nothing else, you can feel the energy and the excitement that I have for my research. There are times when I hate's a strong word. I don't want to talk about singlehood. It's going to ebb and flow, but you got to find something you love, because you will fall in love with this research all over again. So at the beginning, find something that you love to do research on and you want to engage with, because there's going to be times when you absolutely hate it. But if nothing else, you have to say Dr. Marsh really enjoys the work that she does and the scholarship that she has produced. And so many questions that I've left unanswered that I hope that somebody picks up the baton and carries the conversation forward.
I had a question.
Yes.
I was curious if you could speak, like, did you get a sense that people had sort of like different levels of identity salience when it came to singlehood? Like, did you find that for some people, singlehood was like a really prominent part of their identity? For others, it wasn't? Like,
yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I just wrote an article with Eliakim Kislev, who I consider to be a friend. And we were kind of talking about how singlehood should be an identity. And I think, like, you know, one of the things I could have possibly done, but I chose not to do it, and it was intentional. I probably could have developed like a typology, but I'm arguing that there's a demographic shift away from married couples to young Black professionals who aren't married, don't have children, that I didn't want to put the typology out. I just wanted to talk about the group. If I were to continue with this research, I could then start talking about the different types of like singles that we see in the group, but I didn't want to get that far into the conversation. I just wanted to kind of introduce the group from the quantitative to the qualitative. But I do think, like, yeah, there are some people like, I'm really happy with being single. I can't see myself getting married. I cannot do that. There are some people that are like, yeah, I hope it happens, but I'm not. Some people are like, I hope it happens, but if it doesn't, I'm great. Some people are like, look, I'm single, but I ain't trying to make no political statement. I'm out here in these cornfields out here by myself, but this ain't the way I wanted it to be. They also had, I think I included something about the cornfield in the book. I don't know if that made it or not. But it was what was really interesting, because I really did want to write this book about men. But then I was like, I got to buy a Rolex. I want everybody to buy my book. I'm putting men in this book so everybody can buy this book. Still not getting a Rolex, but really happy with the decision to include men, because there were like some gender differences that showed up. One is I talked about briefly about the friendship networks and how they had non-romantic nurturing friends. And Black women really had that thing on lock. They had friends that they could go to church with, they could go to brunch with, they could go golfing with, they could use profanity with, they can have, movie nights with. The men just really didn't talk about that. So I'm happy that that showed up. But also, there are, and I never, as a sociologist, I never know what to make of this. And every time I look at the finding, I'm like, what does this mean? Then some of the women were hopeful that they would get married one day. And for the men, it was just a matter of time before they did. And the reason why I often kind of like say, well, what do we make of that? I think a lot of times we police Black women, they tell them, they tell you who we can and cannot marry. We can't marry up, we can't marry down, we can't do this, we can't do that. I was like, but it sounds like these men out here are the ones that are just choosing anybody out here that's willy-nilly just choosing folks. So why don't we police Black men? Stop policing Black women, go police some Black.
Do you think that that's like an age issue? Like, do you think that, like is it that women, like their dating pool might be a bit more constrained in terms of like men's ages, whereas men are willing to date someone who's considerably younger than
It
them?
could be. Age might have something to do with it. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure. But people are quick to want to police Black women and their choices, but not Black men. That part is true. Now, whether it's because of the age and they're constrained, well, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But I think it's a really great, it's an interesting conversation. And I'm so glad that I included men in the conversation so that we can engage in the conversation. Well, every time I look at that finding, I'm like, what could this actually possibly mean? And I was on a podcast just the other day. And so I was like, stop policing Black women. There was a Black woman, I don't know her name, and it was a couple of months ago. It was a big brouhaha, like on social media. And I think they asked if she would date like a bus driver. And so she was like, no, I won't date a bus driver, but I'll date the owner of a fleet of buses. And people are like, oh, she's just being bougie, and she's just a money grubbing leech and gold digger and blah, 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 blah. Again, stop policing Black women. If we look at like the social science literature, there's a whole stuff that talks about educational homogamy. You typically marry people that look like you, whether or not that's race, whether or not that's class status, whether or not that's economics. You typically marry somebody that looks like you. Because of structural forces, we have to have this conversation among Black Americans, and in particular Black women, and police them. We're not having this conversation with white women. Let's have that conversation. Let's not keep policing Black women, telling them what they should and should not do. Ask why we don't have these same kind of conversations with white women. That's where I want to hinge myself in the conversation, not like why. Why are Black women marrying, or why can't Black women marry up, marry down? That's kind of like almost puts us in that deficit model, almost keeps us at the individual level. And I'm like, let's look at the structure. And people be like, that's a killjoy. I'm like, but it's the truth. It's more salacious and exciting and be like, oh, okay, well, why are Black women doing this? Why? But no, it's a structural conversation, I think, that's missing from the overall conversation. And so I think after that, I think I kind of shut the podcast down. They're like, okay, well, Dr. Marsh, glad to have you. We'll go ahead and Emma, you have your hand up.
Hi, Dr. Marsh. Thank you so much.
Emma.
Hello.
A pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I just had a question regarding your research, whether or not you found that like changing attitudes regarding gender and gender norms or expectations perhaps might have been a driving force behind the singlehood.
Emma, this is why I need to retire. And I am going to retire. I don't know what I'm going to do on the other side of retirement, but I'm 10 years from now, I'll be retired. Because it's so funny because some of the names, they're not the real names, they're pseudonyms. One of the persons in the book, their name is Melinda. And Melinda is like is the name of one of my running partners. And the Melinda in the book is nothing like the Melinda. So whenever I say Melinda, I was like, this is so not Melinda. This is just so not Melinda. My students pick the names, not me. But anyways, Melinda is one of the people in the book, and she was like, here's how we messed up, and here's where we messed up. We need to go back to the good old days where like women were basically barefoot and pregnant, the Betty Crocker days. When I say Betty Crocker to some of my students have no idea who Betty Crocker is. I even had to put it in a footnote who Betty Crocker was. I was like, it's time to go. If I'm like, you don't understand in my references. I also talk about Murphy Brown. When we think about like how they pathologize single parenthood, pathologized it when it looked like me. But then they wrote a whole episode on Murphy Brown. If y'all don't know who Murphy Brown is, Google it. And it became the hot in vogue thing to do. My students are like, Murphy who? How do you spell it, Dr. Marsh? I'm trying to Google it. I was like, it's time for me to go. It is absolutely time for me to go. But so yes, there were a select few people that said, we don't have this patriarchal kind of structure in place, and that's all out of balance. We need to get it back in balance where the man is the head and the woman the head. And once we get there, our marriage rates would change and marriage rates would increase in Black America. Emma, you don't know how bad as a scholar, I'm like, I just wanted to lose that narrative and not put it in the book.
I understand.
Oh my God, I have to be sensitive to the data, and that is what the data says. I can challenge it, but I actually had to put that in the book, and that's like in chapter, I think it's in chapter 3 or something like that. So yeah, gender did like, Some people had very traditional gender kind of ideologies. I think that that's why the marriage rates are so low, because we have fallen out of that idea. Yeah, really
Sure.
great.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me as well, just based on kind of my world and what I hear from people and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think
Thanks
you
for the
certainly
question.
convinced me to get the book. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not studying sociology, but I'm just really interested.
But I really do think like, okay, because like a lot of people don't even know who Anna Julia Cooper is. So I would argue that it's chock full, and other people can maybe challenge me on this, but it's chock full with like little like golden nuggets that you just might want to learn as as a scholar, not just sociology. Because one of the other footnotes that I talk about, two footnotes. Okay, I'll come back to that. But two footnotes I'll come back to if we get a chance, because we have another question. So I want to make sure that people have time to ask questions. So Laura.
Thank you. It's Lara, but I respond to Laura as well. So anything close. First, just wanted to say thank you for the talk and for your energy. It's a delight to be a part of, and it's contagious. So I appreciate that.
But I think that's why they put me in the summer. They're like, oh, we need all this energy to go into the summer. That's like, yeah, they knew what they were doing. So thank you.
And it's a Friday afternoon can be a tough time slot. So thank you very much for bringing all that energy. I had one question. It's really just curious on your thoughts. So you mentioned very specifically about the participants you recruited being it was from the DC, Virginia, and what was the M? Was that
Maryland.
Okay, perfect. And so, but I was kind of curious, and you mentioned, some caution about to what extent these findings and experiences might be similar in other places around the United States, other regions. And I was especially curious about that because you point, I think, very wisely to many of the systemic societal factors that might be, artificially, well, very really affecting people's choices and opportunities. And so I was wondering what you think about. I mean, this is all wagering a guess, of course, and to be seen in the data, but it strikes me that many of these like tax infrastructural rules and whatnot might be many of them are national policies that hold, some living conditions quite consistently around the United States. So I was just curious about your thoughts on variability.
Yeah, so and I appreciate that because I've gotten that question a lot, and I'm like, okay, I don't know how the Love Jones cohort would hold up in the Deep South in the Bible Belt, right? I would argue that like somebody in Mobile, Alabama trying to be a single, it's much more challenging in Mobile, Alabama than it is in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. It's side note, really funny because like I was from LA and I moved to DC and I was like, okay, why are people so excited about the Department of Motor Vehicles? They mention it like in every conversation. But DMV, I swear, I was like, y'all really like the Department of Motor Vehicles out here for real? Okay. Stay focused. But in the Deep South, it might be very different. DC, it's easy. The Northeast, I don't know. I don't know about the liberal West Coast either. That is like there's just some really great questions. I think the way in which they think about singlehood, how they navigate singlehood might be very different in other spaces. That is a absolutely wonderful dissertation for someone, and prove me wrong or challenge me. I don't care. Just be sure and cite me. And buy the real book, don't buy the bootleg book, buy the whole book. But I love so many questions. I love so many open questions for students. I don't know. I don't know. That's a short and long answer. I really don't know. It'd be fascinating to find out though.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Marissa, I think you have your hand up. Marissa?
Yep. First of all, thank you. Really amazing talk. It was my cat was being a little bit strange halfway through, but I was still kind of like listening because it was very engaging and very interesting. It was hard to not listen to you. So yeah, really,
that's the beauty of
do feel your energy. I'm wondering, and I don't know if I missed this just from the distraction, but did you have any participants who identified as like queer or lesbian, gay? And if so, were there any particular findings from their interviews that you thought were like really unique to them or just really interesting?
Yeah, no, Marissa, that's a really great question. I usually say that, and I forgot to say that. We did try to recruit from the DMV because we do have like a nice population of part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but we only got one person who openly identified as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, and his name was Peter. And so Peter's respondents were pretty similar to everybody else's respondents. So he said, we were talking about like we talked about like dating by choice or circumstance or something like, oh, the rise had never married, I think. And he's like, I'll date a white man, but I really want to marry a black man. And like other women, black women said that too. They're like, I'll date a white man, but I want little black, brown babies. I want little chocolate babies. And so it was no different. So there wasn't enough to see any bit of a difference. But we did try to recruit for the LGBTQIA plus community. We just didn't get that. And it's unfortunate because we're right there in the area. And I thought we have a huge population, but it just didn't show up. But I do want to say something that's kind of like, well, it's kind of unique. I have a question for the students. I legit have a question for you all, and I want an answer. So, like I said, I don't know if I said this part, we interviewed like 75 people, but we had to delete some of the people or exclude them. Some people like midway through the interview, like 45 minutes in, like, well, I was married, but my ex-husband's dead to me, so I'm never married. I'm like, that's not exactly how that works. I was like, you can't do that. Some people would say, my children are money grubbing leeches, so they're not going to get anything once they turn 18. And I'm like, okay, but you have children. You get to make the decision with your assets that you're not going to give it to your children, and you make other decisions. I want people who don't have children. Who were you going to transfer your assets to? By the record, spoiler alert for that chapter, they're transferring it to their niece and nephews and friends, children of their friends. Again, this is why augmented families should be politically recognized so that you can get some tax write-offs that you're bequeathing your assets to your friends' children. Anyways, what was I talking about? So I had some people were married, we had to get rid of them. Some people like had children, we had to get rid of them. There's students, I want an answer. There was one person, we recruited for Black people that think they're middle class. There's one person who showed up whose street race was not Black. I was like, unless they're really, 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 really light skinned, I don't think they're Black. So we go through the whole interview, come to find out they're not Black. They don't identify as Black, but they went to a historical Black college. They date Black people. They are in a fraternity or sorority, and they grew up. I want to say, for some reason, I want to say their parents were Black and adopted them. I don't remember that part. It's been so long, that might have been the case. So students, could I have included this person in the data set? Okay, so we all agree, no, we can't include that person in the data set. Now, if you heard me, what I said was that I did a snowball sample. So for every person we interviewed, we asked if they knew 5 people that fit the demographics. So the 5 people that this non-Black person gave us, can we include them in the data set? I didn't. My students were like, yeah, we can. And I was like, I had to give away all that. I had to throw away all that good data. But I was like, I didn't want to go to the IRB jail. And I thought about it like this. I was like, it's the fruit from the forbidden tree. Had we not known him, we would have never had these other 5 people. So I just wanted to keep it really clean and really simple. And I really didn't want to have any issues with IRB. So I was like, not to say IRB was going to say anything, but I said no. So I had to get rid of like those 6 people simply because of the fruit. They were the fruit of the forbidden tree. Oh, it broke my heart. But at the end of the day, I know it was the right thing to do. And I'm glad that I did go that route because I still had 62 other respondents that I could draw from. And we met saturation, so it really didn't matter. Yeah.
Did you include, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just sort of curious, like kind of on this topic, like did you include people that were like biracial or multiracial? So they still obviously identify and have Black heritage, but just sort of curious if they were included in this or not.
I don't think they were. Because I think we had one person that actually identified as biracial, and we're like, thank you. I think we had enough like interviews at the time. We're like, thank you, but no, thank you. So I don't think we did. I don't think we did. Pretty sure we didn't. I'm not sure. I don't think we did. I know we had somebody. I don't know what we did with their data. I don't think we included them. We had one person. Yeah. Which I think opens up another conversation. Like, how would the biracial conversation complicate the story?
Well, I think I just saw a paper published about how biracial individuals are perceived more positively by everybody. So they're perceived more positively from white participants, but also participants who are Asian. I think it might have, all I saw was like a white Asian biracial person in the blog, but I didn't actually look at specific.
Oh, well, no. Okay. So I talk about that in the book explicitly. And what from some of the social science literature, those that are lighter skin, because colorism is real, right? Closer to white being more attractive. They actually have better outcomes on like pretty much every single marker. It's kind of like the halo effect. So they're thought of as being more attractive. They get more education. Therefore, because they get more education, they go to more prestigious universities. Therefore, they get higher degrees. Therefore, they get higher salaries. So yeah, I absolutely talk about that. And let me tell you why that's important to me. One of my dear friends, always, he's a black guy, and he always talks about, I just like light-skinned black women. I just like light-skinned black women. He says it all the time. So one day he said it, and I was like, no, you don't. And I gave a really long pregnant pause. I was like, I would respect you more if you were to say, I've been conditioned from a very young age that closer to white is right and is thought of as more attractive. I can respect that. But the fact that you keep saying, I just like light-skinned women, I was like, you're not even thinking about how you're conditioned from a very young age. Similar to the idea of singlehood. And so I'm like, you were conditioned. Why do you want to be married? It's a very simple question, but it's a very complicated answer. We've been conditioned from a very young age that we are supposed to be married and we are supposed to be partnered. Forgive me, please correct me if I'm wrong, but people are saying that there's some data coming out. I haven't found it myself, but there's some data, some research out there that's suggesting that people that are married, their spouses, when people are married or partnered, when their spouse gets sick or their partner gets sick, they're leaving and bailing on them because they don't know how to deal with sick partners. So it's important that we don't put all of our eggs in the marriage basket. And even if you do get married, still cultivate your friends, because your friends will show up for you when you're sick. Your mate or your partner may or may not show up for you. So why do you want to be married? And people say, I want to be in a relationship. And I'm like, okay, you need to clarify what kind of relationship you want to be in, because you need to say, I want to be in a romantic relationship. We are in relationships every single day. And when you say, I want to be in a relationship, you're forsaking all of your non-romantic, nurturing friends that will show up for you. If I'm on the phone with one of my girlfriends and I even cough, before I could put the phone down, I've got chicken noodle soup at my house. I've got ginger ale and I got saltine crackers, the trilogy to make you feel better in Black America. Okay, now in the book, one of the respondents, I didn't actually put it in the book. You know I'm talking about that trilogy is true. One of the respondents in the book talked about how she can outsource things. She can go to like Uber and get stuff like when she's sick. And I don't think this made it into the book, but she also talked about that she was dating this one guy. She's like, I'm not feeling well. Can you go to the store and get me some, like, chicken noodle soup and blah, 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 blah. He's like, yeah, sure. Cash at me and I'll go get you chicken. I was like, I can't. My girlfriend has never asked for money back for the chicken noodle soup that I gave her. One of my dearest friends, the one Jackie Pierce who told me when I get turned 50, I'm going to just get freedom. She would never ask for the money back. So I think that it's really important for us to figure out like why we want to be married. I think marriage is a beautiful thing if it is done right. I say it in the preface of my book. Black marriage and marriage is a beautiful thing if it's done right. And for the record, I get hate mail on a regular basis saying that I'm bad for Black America. I'm not promoting marriage. And I am all about marriage, but I'm not gonna just promote marriage, just blanket marriage for the sake of being married. I'm not doing that. I'm absolutely not doing that. So thank you. So like, yeah, I'm glad my decision as a researcher to say, no, we cannot have this person and we can't have anybody else that's related to this person in the data set. Any other questions?
All right. Well, a round of applause. Thank you so much to Dr. Kris Marsh. I love that talk so much. I think a lot of people did. I think hopefully it gives people, interesting things to think about over the summer. And we will be back in the fall for a whole other seminar series. But I will take this opportunity also just if we can have a round of applause for Lara, for Tiara, for Hannah. I think those are the three people that have been organizing our seminar series this last year. So thank you for all your efforts and all the amazing people. And Kris, again, thank you so much for coming out. We hope you enjoy your dinner and that your flight goes well tomorrow.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really did have a great time talking about the book, and hopefully gave you some things to think about as you go into the summer.
Well, I look forward to seeing you at IARR in
Yes.
Boston.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you.